The spark in Kosovo. By 1990, the illusion of unity in Yugoslavia had shattered. But it was Kosovo, the cradle of Serbian identity and the flashpoint of Albanian nationalism, that would provide one of the most volatile accelerants in the Federation's collapse. The province, nestled in the southern corner of Serbia, had always carried a weight far beyond its geographic size. To Serbs, Kosovo was sacred. It was the site of the 1389 Battle of Kosovo-Polje, where Prince Lazar had stood, mythically, against the Ottomans in a doomed but glorified last stand. To lose Kosovo, they believed, was to lose the heart of Serbia itself. To Kosovo's Albanian majority, however, it was their home, their land, and increasingly, a prison. Since the 1974 Constitution, Kosovo had enjoyed substantial autonomy, almost functioning as a republic in all but name. It had its own parliament, police force, media, and education system. Albanian culture thrived, but this autonomy became the object of Serbian resentment. Many Serbs believed they were being pushed out of their ancestral homeland, their churches vandalized, their rights trampled by a hostile majority. Slobodan Milošević capitalized on these fears with surgical precision. In 1989, under the guise of constitutional reform, he pushed legislation through the Serbian Assembly that effectively revoked Kosovo's autonomy. The province's parliament, overwhelmingly Albanian, was surrounded by tanks and military police. Under intimidation and duress, the reforms passed. From that moment, Kosovo was back under direct Serbian control. To the Albanians, it was nothing less than a coup. Teachers were fired en masse for refusing to teach Serbian-approved curricula. Albanian-language newspapers were shut down. Public sector jobs were cleansed of ethnic Albanians. Thousands of families suddenly found themselves without income, without protection, without a voice. But the response wasn't a violent rebellion. At least not yet. Instead, what emerged was a silent resistance. Led by a former literature professor named Ibrahim Rugova, the Albanians of Kosovo created a parallel society. Schools went underground. Hospitals operated in private homes. An entire shadow state was born, not with guns but with chalkboards and medical kits. It was an extraordinary act of defiance, peaceful, determined, yet dangerously fragile. In the rest of Yugoslavia, the conflict in Kosovo was seen through the lens of nationalism. Slovenia and Croatia, already drifting from Belgrade, sided openly with the Albanians. Their media portrayed the crackdown as authoritarian and anti-democratic. Serbia saw this as betrayal. To Milošević and his followers, it was proof that the Serbs were being targeted from all sides. And the anger boiled. In early 1989, a new political tension began to rise across the republics. Amid the rising unrest, Raif Dizdarević, a Bosnian Muslim and then president of the rotating Yugoslav presidency, made an impassioned plea during a rally of Serbian protesters. He stepped onto the platform, face weathered by war and politics, and uttered words heavy with desperation. "Our fathers died to create Yugoslavia. We will not go down the road to national conflict. We will take the path of brotherhood and unity." For a brief moment, the crowd applauded, but words were no longer enough. Throughout 1989, massive street protests, both in support of and against Milošević, swept across the Federation. Flags of individual republics began to outnumber the Yugoslav flag. Hate speech crept into the newspapers. Ethnic insults once whispered behind closed doors were now chanted in city squares. In Slovenia, the ruling League of Communists openly defied Belgrade. In Croatia, Tudjman began laying the groundwork for independence. Each republic began forming its own police forces, quietly arming them in preparation for what many now viewed as inevitable. But Milošević wasn't finished. He engineered one final political move. Replacing the leaders of Kosovo, Vojvodina, and Montenegro with loyalists through orchestrated mass protests and backroom deals. In less than 2 years, he had centralized power over 4 of the 8 federal units in Yugoslavia, all under the banner of protecting Serbian interests. To the other republics, this was a hostile takeover. Slovenia and Croatia saw the writing on the wall. If Serbia controlled half of Yugoslavia's presidency, the federation itself had been hijacked. What choice was left but to leave? But the Serbs had their own fears. Their people were scattered across the republics. Over 12% of Croatia's population was Serb. In Bosnia, the ethnic mix was even more dangerous. 1/3 Muslim, Bosniak, 1/3 Serb, 1/3 Croat. If the federation collapsed, what would happen to the Serbs outside Serbia? Would they be protected or purged? That fear turned into calculation. Throughout 1990, Serb communities in Croatia, especially in regions like Krajina, began mobilizing. Under the leadership of Milan Babić, they declared the Serbian Autonomous Oblast of Krajina, a breakaway state within Croatia. Armed checkpoints went up. Roads were blocked. They declared they would remain loyal to Belgrade, no matter what Zagreb said. This was not just a local revolt. It was a powder keg with federal consequences. When Tudjman tried to reassert Croatian authority, the Yugoslav army, largely controlled by Serb officers, intervened again. Helicopters sent by the Croatian government to the Serb-held areas were ordered to turn back by the Yugoslav Air Force. The message was unambiguous. Croatia could not act against its own separatists without provoking a broader military response. By now, it was clear. The Yugoslav army was no longer neutral. It was becoming Milošević's army. Western diplomats watched nervously as the tension escalated. European powers called for dialogue. The United States, caught up in the Gulf War and uncertain of the region's complexity, offered only vague warnings. But inside Yugoslavia, time was running out. In the streets of Knin, Sarajevo, Ljubljana, and Zagreb, people stocked up on food. Parents whispered of evacuation routes. Journalists braced for the worst. Every day felt like the final calm before the storm. And through it all, the question lingered. Who would fire the first shot? By 1990, the collapse of Yugoslavia had already begun in everything but name. What remained was a ritualistic game of diplomacy, attempts at negotiation that, to those watching from the ground, felt like theater played out on the brink of war. Each republic was now governed by parties that represented ethnic interests, not shared ideology. Communism, once the binding thread, had unraveled. In its place came the flags of the past, the red and white checkerboard of Croatia, the tricolor of Serbia, the medieval coat of arms of Slovenia. Symbols once buried were now paraded openly, proudly, defiantly. The Yugoslav Federal Presidency, now mostly symbolic, attempted to maintain order. But it was a house divided. Decisions required consensus, and consensus was no longer possible. Every discussion came down to one question: do we stay or do we go? For Slovenia, the answer was increasingly clear. The republic, prosperous and westernized, had little patience for the chaos. Its leadership, under Milan Kučan, was determined to chart a new course, toward Europe, toward independence, toward control over its own future. In public speeches, Kučan no longer spoke of unity. He spoke of sovereignty. Croatia followed a similar path. Under Franjo Tudjman, a former general-turned-nationalist politician, Croatia began actively distancing itself from Belgrade's orbit. Tudjman spoke of a historic mission to lead the Croatian people to self-rule. His rhetoric was laced with memories of past oppression, of cultural pride, of suffering under Serb-dominated rule. But Tudjman's rise was not without consequence. For the hundreds of thousands of Serbs living in Croatia, his words stirred old fears. Memories of the fascist Ustaše regime of the 1940s came roaring back. Back then, under Nazi sponsorship, the independent state of Croatia had unleashed horrific massacres on Serbs, Jews, and Roma. Entire villages were razed, Orthodox churches were burned. And now, for many Serbs in Krajina, history seemed to echo. Tudjman spoke of a democratic Croatia, but he also restored certain symbols from that dark era, including the red and white checkerboard flag, long associated with the Ustaše. His supporters insisted it was a reclamation of identity. But to the Serbs, it felt like a threat. In response, the SAO Krajina, the self-proclaimed Serbian Autonomous Oblast, grew bolder. In December 1990, they held a referendum, overwhelmingly voting to separate from Croatia and unite with Serbia. Zagreb declared it illegal. Belgrade said little, but Serbian arms began flowing into the region nonetheless. Meanwhile, Bosnia and Herzegovina, perhaps the most diverse and complex republic, watched with increasing dread. Bosnia was home to nearly equal populations of Muslim Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs. Its cities were mosaics of minarets, cathedrals, and Orthodox domes. Its history was a swirl of coexistence and bloodshed. And now, as the federation unraveled, Bosnia faced an impossible choice. To remain in Yugoslavia was to side with Milošević. To leave was to provoke the Serb population within its own borders, who feared becoming a persecuted minority. The middle path, unity, neutrality, peaceful compromise, was fading fast. Even Macedonia, quiet and distant from the storm, began to question its place in the federation. But it had little leverage, no military strength, and far less media attention. Its people braced for fallout. At the federal level, the final blow came in 1991, when the Yugoslav presidency collapsed into irreconcilable deadlock. The 8-member collective, composed of representatives from each republic and autonomous province, could no longer make decisions. Meetings devolved into shouting matches. Walkouts became common. Threats were exchanged across microphones. At the federal level, the final blow came in 1991, when the Yugoslav presidency collapsed into irreconcilable deadlock. The 8-member collective, composed of representatives from each republic and autonomous province, could no longer make decisions. Meetings devolved into shouting matches. Walkouts became common. Threats were exchanged across microphones. Milošević, now the most powerful man in the federation, made no effort to conceal his dominance. He no longer masked his ambitions behind the language of unity. He spoke of Serbian rights, Serbian destiny, Serbian lands. He had stacked the military leadership with loyalists, transformed the media into a mouthpiece, and secured legal control over nearly half the federal apparatus. The army, once designed to defend the nation from outside enemies, was now poised to turn inward. On June 25, 1991, Slovenia and Croatia officially declared independence. The move was not unexpected, but it was explosive. Belgrade denounced the declarations as illegal. The Yugoslav People's Army, JNA, moved quickly to assert control over Slovenia's border posts and key infrastructure. Tanks rolled across quiet highways. Helicopters filled the sky. Roadblocks went up. It was the beginning of the 10-day war. But Slovenia was prepared. Its territorial defense forces, trained in guerrilla warfare and fueled by nationalism, resisted with skill and determination. And unlike Croatia or Bosnia, Slovenia had no large Serb minority to complicate the conflict. The fighting was intense but brief. After 10 days, the Yugoslav army pulled back. International mediators stepped in. Slovenia, for all intents and purposes, was now independent. Croatia, however, was a different story. As the ink dried on its declaration, war erupted almost immediately. The JLA, claiming to protect ethnic Serbs, moved to secure Serb-majority areas in eastern Croatia. Villages were shelled. Cities burned. Civilians fled. The town of Vukovar, a once charming riverside community, was turned into rubble over 87 days of siege. Hospitals were bombed. Prisoners were executed. The world watched in horror. And this was just the beginning. Ethnic militias rose on both sides. The line between army and paramilitary blurred. The Yugoslav flag still flew from tanks, but the orders came from Belgrade. Croatia armed itself in return, relying on smuggled weapons and hastily trained volunteers. Massacres followed, retaliations. Propaganda campaigns painted the enemy as subhuman. Churches were desecrated. Mass graves grew. In Bosnia, the fear turned into panic. If this was what happened to Croatia, what chance did a mixed republic like Bosnia have? Meanwhile, the international community struggled to respond. The European community, now the European Union, issued vague calls for peace. The United Nations passed resolutions. But no real action was taken. No troops, no intervention, just diplomacy. Painfully slow, tragically late. In the cities of Yugoslavia, sirens replaced church bells. Bunkers replaced classrooms. What had once been abstract discussions of sovereignty were now fought in blood and fire. And as the war lines hardened, a new truth became clear. Yugoslavia was no longer a country. It was a battlefield. The war begins. It began with roadblocks and escalated into artillery fire. The slogans of nationalism became orders for execution, and the dream, however flawed, of a united Yugoslavia vanished beneath smoke and blood. The Yugoslav Wars, a term that now covers a decade of conflict, officially ignited in 1991. But this was not a single war. It was a chain reaction, a disintegration of a state where every falling piece tore into the next. The first battlefield was Croatia. After declaring independence, Croatia quickly found itself at war not just with the Yugoslav People's Army, JNA, but with Serb militias operating within its borders. Armed and often backed by Belgrade, these forces aimed to carve out a new map, one where Serb-majority areas would be liberated from Croatian control and eventually united with Serbia. Cities like Vukovar, Dubrovnik, and Osijek became targets. The siege of Vukovar in particular became a symbol of brutality. A city of 40,000 was reduced to ruins. After nearly 3 months of shelling and urban warfare, the JNA captured the city, only to hand over prisoners to Serb paramilitaries. Many were executed in the fields outside the city. Hospitals were emptied. Civilians disappeared. The images of Vukovar's destruction shocked the world. But the world remained distant. There were condemnations, news headlines, satellite images, but no intervention, no NATO bombers, no peacekeepers strong enough to stop what had begun. Meanwhile, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the most fragile republic in terms of ethnic balance, stood on the edge of the abyss. In March 1992, Bosnia declared independence after a referendum, boycotted by most of its Serb population. Almost immediately, Bosnian Serbs, under the leadership of Radovan Karadzic, declared their own republic, the Republika Srpska. Backed by the JNA and supported by Serbian paramilitaries, they moved to seize territory and cleanse it of non-Serbs. It was here that the war descended into something darker than borders and flags. It became genocide. Villages were emptied. Men and boys were separated and executed. Women were imprisoned and raped in camps. Mosques were flattened. Churches were torched. The very idea of coexistence, of mixed cities, mixed marriages, mixed memories, was being annihilated. The siege of Sarajevo, which began in April 1992, would become the longest in modern history. For nearly 4 years, Bosnia's capital was encircled by Serb forces. From the surrounding hills, snipers picked off civilians at random. Children walking to school, grandmothers carrying bread. The Olympic Stadium, once filled with athletes, became a mass graveyard. The city was starved, shelled, and strangled, while the world watched live on television. In the West, there was confusion. Was this a civil war? A war of religion? Of independence? Of empire? The truth was all of it, and none of it. To some, it was revenge for 600 years of history. To others, it was ethnic cleansing disguised as nationalism. And to many, it was simply survival. The United Nations deployed peacekeepers, but their mandate was weak. They could observe, not intervene, protect, not attack. The blue helmets became witnesses, sometimes shields, sometimes helpless bystanders. In Srebrenica, a UN-protected safe area, more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys were rounded up and executed in July 1995. It was the worst massacre on European soil since World War II. The international community's slow and cautious response became a stain on its conscience. Only in the mid-1990s, after years of mounting atrocities and growing pressure from media and human rights organizations, did real intervention begin. In 1995, NATO launched a bombing campaign against Bosnian Serb forces. The Dayton Accords, signed later that year in Ohio, brought an uneasy peace to Bosnia, dividing it into two entities, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, mostly Bosniak and Croat, and Republika Srpska, mostly Serb. The war had ended, but the wounds had not. While Bosnia bled, Macedonia had quietly declared independence in 1991, peacefully and without war. But even there, ethnic tensions simmered between the Slavic majority and the Albanian minority, leading to a brief armed conflict a decade later. Back in Croatia by 1995, the tide had turned. In Operation Storm, a massive military offensive, Croatian forces recaptured the Serb-held Krajina region. Hundreds of thousands of Serbs fled in what became one of the largest single acts of ethnic displacement in the war. Though Croatia celebrated victory, the cost in civilian lives and long-term division was immense. And then there was Kosovo, the place where the fire had first been lit. Throughout the early 1990s, the conflict in Kosovo remained largely suppressed. The Albanian majority continued its passive resistance under the leadership of Ibrahim Rugova, establishing underground schools, clinics, and governance structures. But by the mid-1990s, younger Albanians were losing faith in nonviolence. Out of this frustration, the Kosovo Liberation Army (KLA) emerged, a guerrilla force determined to fight Serbian rule with weapons, not petitions. They launched ambushes, assassinated officials, attacked police stations. The Serbian response under Milošević was brutal and indiscriminate. Entire villages were torched, families executed, mass graves filled. By 1998, Kosovo was in full revolt. Refugees poured into neighboring Albania and Macedonia. Western powers, haunted by the slow response in Bosnia, this time acted faster. In 1999, NATO, without UN approval, launched an aerial bombing campaign against Serbia. For 78 days, missiles struck Belgrade, bridges collapsed, military targets were destroyed, but civilians also died. The goal was to force Milošević to withdraw from Kosovo, and he did. Kosovo came under UN administration, patrolled by NATO troops. The war had cost thousands of lives, mostly Albanian civilians, and permanently changed Serbia's relationship with the world. The wars were over, but the idea of Yugoslavia, its promise, its myth, its nightmare, was now dust. Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, and eventually Montenegro all went their separate ways. The final legal death of the Federation came on February 4, 2003, when Serbia and Montenegro, the last remnants, formally changed their name from Yugoslavia to the State Union of Serbia and Montenegro. 3 years later, in 2006, even that union dissolved, and with it the name Yugoslavia vanished from the map. All that remained was memory and scars. Death of a nation. When the dust finally settled, there were no victors, only survivors. Yugoslavia, once hailed as a model for multicultural socialism, had become a cautionary tale etched in graveyards, ruins, and the haunted silence of cities that once rang with laughter in many languages. What was born of unity had died of division, not with a swift collapse, but with a slow, agonizing unraveling, marked by war crimes, shattered identities, and the permanent fracture of trust. In 2003, the name Yugoslavia was quietly retired. The Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, already a ghost of its former self, was rebranded as the State Union of Serbia and Montenegro. This final act of redefinition was bureaucratic, bloodless, and overlooked by most of the world. But symbolically, it was the last breath of a nation that had tried, for nearly a century, to hold opposites together. That union, too, did not last. On June 3, 2006, Montenegro, after a peaceful referendum, declared independence, choosing to part ways with Serbia. The decision was not driven by hatred, but by weariness. A quiet acknowledgement that the idea of togetherness had cost too much. 2 days later, Serbia, now alone, officially declared itself the legal successor to all that had come before. And just like that, Yugoslavia was gone. But its legacy, violent, complicated, human, remained. The deepest of all scars would perhaps belong to Kosovo. Its status, even decades later, remains unresolved in the eyes of many. In 2008, Kosovo declared its independence from Serbia. To its people, mostly ethnic Albanians, it was liberation long delayed. To Serbia, it was an open wound, a theft of history, a betrayal of sovereignty. More than 100 countries, including the United States and many EU nations, recognized Kosovo as a sovereign nation. But others, Russia, China, and of course Serbia itself, refused. And within Kosovo's own borders, a significant minority of Serbs still reject its independence. Kosovo today is a fragile piece. International forces still patrol the region. Tensions flare with alarming regularity. The shadows of the 1990s are never far away. Yet, in Sarajevo, Ljubljana, Zagreb, Skopje, Podgorica, and Pristina, life moves on. Skyscrapers rise. Airports bustle. Cafes fill. A new generation is growing up without direct memory of the war, but inescapably shaped by it. What then destroyed Yugoslavia? Historians will cite many causes. The ethnic divisions that lay dormant for decades, sharpened by centuries of foreign rule and historical grievances. The failure to redraw internal borders to reflect demographic realities. The economic collapse following global crises and heavy foreign debt. The death of Tito, whose authoritarian glue held together a federation built on contradiction. The rise of nationalism, inflamed by opportunistic leaders who found power not in unity, but in fear. But more than any one cause, it was the loss of shared belief. Yugoslavia was a dream born in the aftermath of imperial collapse and global war. It asked people to forget too much, too quickly. It demanded loyalty to a state that had not yet earned their trust. It silenced identity instead of transforming it. And when that silence was broken, it became a scream. There were moments, brief, fragile, remarkable, when Yugoslavia almost worked. When the streets of Sarajevo thrived with Muslims, Christians, and Jews. When Croats and Serbs played together on the national soccer team. When the Adriatic coast welcomed tourists from every continent. When the identity Yugoslav meant something beyond compromise. But those moments were not enough to stop the tide of history. Nationalism, once reawakened, is hard to put back to sleep. It promises pride, justice, belonging. But it often delivers rage, grievance, and isolation. And in the Balkans, where history is remembered in centuries and every grave is political, nationalism became a force too powerful to restrain. The war crimes trials at The Hague would bring some justice. Leaders like Slobodan Milošević, Radovan Karadzic, and Ratko Mladic would face judgment. But many others would not. Many wounds would never truly heal. Too many people would return to villages that no longer existed, or pass through towns where their name alone could provoke a fist, or worse. Today, When you visit the Balkans, you'll see more than ruins. You'll see resilience. Children who dance to music in 3 languages, students who cross borders to study, survivors who, against all odds, choose reconciliation over revenge. New flags fly, but old songs still echo. The region does not forget, but it endures. Yugoslavia is gone. But its story remains one of the most complex tragedies of the modern age, a story of hope, fear, betrayal, ambition, memory, and identity. A story where lines on a map could never fully contain the hearts of the people who lived there. And perhaps, in remembering what went wrong, we find the fragments of what might have been. Not to resurrect Yugoslavia, but to learn from its fall, to remember what happens when leaders weaponize history, when neighbors become enemies, and when unity becomes a myth too fragile to survive reality. In the end, Yugoslavia was not killed by a single bullet, or broken by one man. It died from within. And its final lesson? A country can endure war, poverty, even dictatorship. But it cannot endure the loss of shared belonging. And that is how a country dies. Not from a foreign invasion, but from the fractures within. Yugoslavia was not killed. It collapsed on its own. Because the truth is this: a nation can survive war, poverty, even dictatorship, but it cannot survive the loss of shared belonging. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it, because sometimes history isn't just a record of the past, it's a warning for the future. You've been watching PHT Eternal Mysteries, where the forgotten truths of the past come alive.